everyone. Today we're going to be going through the NUSPA 2023 quarterfinals motion and the motion for the round red. This House would abolish the GRC system. So before we get into the motion proper, important to do a couple of things. And the first is to break down the motion. So for motions that are about abolishing something, obviously you need to consider why the harms are greater than the benefits. But note specifically that to abolish something or to ban something, the degree of harm does need to be relatively high. So that means your impacting should be there. You cannot just simply run a soft line stance and say there's some marginal degree of harm, because then all opposition needs to do is prove some marginal degree of benefit. So yeah, for motions like this, think about the impacts. Why are the impacts important? Second question, what exactly is the motion trying to solve? And I think this is something that's important to ask, especially for motions that seem to be trying to solve a lot of things, like for instance, the GRC motion, as we'll go into later, a couple of different problems and issues that it could solve, right? So step one is to just think about what changes in the motion, regardless of whether or not it's good or bad. So what exactly happens when we do abolish the GRC system? I think this helps both teams necessarily get a better understanding of what the debate should actually be about, and also gives you more foresight into what your opponents might say, for instance. So always have the costs, what you are necessarily trading off at the back of your mind when you go into prep to think about motions like this in particular. So some general points of context and characterization. Nothing too new. I think most JC teams should know this, and most of them did in fact know this, but yeah, 4 points of characterization. So the first is that it was initially implemented to guarantee minority representation in parliament. There must be between 3 and 6 MPs. A criticism of the GRC system is that the PAP has used it to bring in first-time candidates into parliament. Whether this is or is not a good thing is, I think, one of the main issues that is up for debate, as we will see later. But yeah. And fourthly, a common criticism of the GRC system is that it disadvantages opposition because by virtue of them being newer and younger, it's more difficult for them to find that same degree of high caliber candidates to that same quantity in order to contest a greater number of GRCs. So the proposition case. So I think what proposition does need to bear in mind during this debate is the cost that they necessarily have to defend. And I think in this debate, the cost is that you probably cannot absolutely guarantee minority representation, or maybe the same degree of minority representation. Or second issue would be the presence of sufficient new candidates. So proposition needs to do 2 things. And the first is to prove why exactly the GRC system is so fundamentally bad that we ought to be able to abolish it. And secondly, why this point of minority representation and new candidates can still happen, or why it is okay if it doesn't happen to the same degree, or why we can then therefore trade it off. So 2 things for proposition to bear in mind. And there are 2 ways prop can go about coming up with a policy. So I think the first is to characterize what the world is likely to look like. I personally think the most probable alternative is single-member constituencies. I know teams that ran the argument that said we will have no constituencies and we will have just one general national elections. I'm not sure how feasible that might be in terms of, like, say, managing Singapore on a more nuanced level, because now you're just applying policies to the state at large. I don't know. I think it would be more efficient or more practicable for the government to do it in the form of SMCs. But yeah, that's just my take on what the most convenient policy for prop should be. And with regards to minority quotas, proposition can do 2 things. The first is to run the soft line stance and say, well, we will still have minority candidates, but we will make this quota regarding to the number of, say, minority candidates a party has to run, rather than in each particular GRC system. So this would mitigate against the greatest harms that opposition can push on you. Or prop can also run the hardline stance and say that we will simply have no quotas at all. Everything will be based on meritocracy. So I think either is defensible. It's honestly up to the teams which one they feel they are better able to prove. So the first argument, and I think the most strategic point for proposition to capitalize on, is the fact that there is a lack of competitiveness in status quo. And by abolishing the GRC system, this is the only way to improve the quality of political candidates within parties, regardless of which party it is. So there's a problem for 2 reasons, incredibly important to set up the problem. The first is that parties can currently piggyback candidates in on established members. So this is where the PAP has a significant advantage because of their political longevity. So it gives them an incumbency advantage. People are more likely to see their ministers as established by virtue of the fact that they've been around longer. And secondly is that they therefore then have more, well, strong ministers. So if a PAP minister has been doing his job for 10 years, and opposition minister has been doing it for 5 years, obviously the PAP minister is going to be seen as stronger because he's been around for longer. Second reason for this problem is that it's difficult for new parties to be able to get sufficient numbers to contest GRCs, right? So opposition parties, because of what we've already said, have fewer established candidates. And what this means is that they must necessarily concentrate their best people on one GRC. They can't afford to spread it out the same way that PAP can, for instance, because they don't have the luxury of that appearance of establishment. So what this means is that it's hard for them to be able to meaningfully contest in GRC. So this significantly lowers the degree of competition regarding elections. So how exactly do we go about solving it? Quite simple, but it's important to explain the lines of logic. So abolishing the system means that you can't piggyback candidates. It means that parties are now going to focus more on training young talent more thoroughly first to ensure why they can stand on their own 2 feet. And this is where your argument is kind of preemptive to what Ott might say. So here you can say that, well, parties won't just simply field their old MPs because they do need to focus on the younger generation. It's simply not feasible for any party to just constantly bank on their already established ministers, because they do need to guarantee the long run plan of who exactly is going to lead the party in the future. So we think the introduction of new candidates will still be a thing anyways, but the difference is that they will be trained better and they will be trained more thoroughly first. And this also means that it's fairer. And it's exclusive because this is the only way to remove the structural disadvantage to opposition, because they are now able to more fairly contest. So they can now do the same things. They can spread out their established members. And overall, this is a good thing because we give people more choice. So this is the impacting of the argument and why exactly it is so fundamentally important, right? And I think the first is quite intuitive. The quality of candidates you have is obviously important because they will be the future leaders of the country, and we do need bright minds to lead the government in the next generation. The second point, slightly less important, but I thought this would have been an interesting angle to take, which is the idea of encouraging democratic choice. Because when candidates make it into parliament, not of their own merit, piggybacking could therefore be considered problematic, because it means that candidates you don't actually meaningfully consent to are getting into parliament. So people might just be voting for that one guy. It is unclear if the rest are seen to be actually representative of the people's wishes. So that's a possible angle that we could have taken. I'm just touching on it briefly here because I don't think it is necessarily as impactful, but this is an angle teams definitely could have gone down the line of. So important to preempt, opposition is likely going to say something along the lines of that. Well, the quality of candidates are already guaranteed by a very rigorous selection process. So we don't need to abolish the entire GRC system in order for there to be more competition. I think the first thing to point out is that the point on competitiveness between parties still stands, because now you level the playing field for less established parties. But on the point of quality of candidates within parties, then you can point out that yes, the selection process is quite rigorous, but the selection process is also broad because at the end of the day, they still want a decently wide talent pool. Also, being selected by a certain party doesn't immediately equate to being a good leader. Then you want to frame it as, at the end of the day, the test is that they must go through the vote, right? Because they're good leaders, not because they are chosen to be leaders by the party, but they're good leaders insofar as they are representative and they are what the people want. So you can frame out the examples Op is likely to give by saying that the worst or the most inadequate candidates are likely going to be exposed by the public, but that is only when they are really, really, really bad, right? And there are candidates who might not be really, really, really bad, but they might also not be of the quality or caliber that you would want your elected representatives to be. And this is the only way to better ensure that we do get sufficiently decent people into parliament, because they stand by the vote of their own merit and they're not banking on, say, senior ministers to be able to get them in. I think it's important to acknowledge the trade-off, right? So the cost on prop is necessarily the idea that it will be much harder to field young talent, but I think we can point out that the party that this impacts the most is the incumbent party, right? So, and this is not going to be overly detrimental since the incumbent is already quite established. So the impact, therefore, is greater upon newer parties like the opposition parties, which are, by virtue of being much younger, they also run much more young candidates. So what this does is that at the end of the day, it's not too detrimental to the PAP, but it is actually quite helpful to other parties. And at the end of the day, this is important because it encourages competitiveness by reducing the incumbency advantage. And it would be worthwhile to explain why this is the only way that this issue can be solved. That's because any reconfiguration of the system, even having, say, less candidates per GRC or having a few more SMCs in general, will still perpetuate this issue, because no matter how we put it, at least for the foreseeable future, the PAP is always going to have the advantage because of how established they are. So therefore, abolishing it is the only way in which we take away that issue of piggybacking. It's the only way in which we take away that issue of opposition parties having to, say, concentrate all of their best members on one spot and not being able to contest other areas. Second argument, not as important, but again, I thought this is an interesting angle that teams could take, which is that this improves the quality and it improves the perception of democratic choice. So the problem in status quo, or the problem that we think we used to have in status quo, is that we needed the GRC system to guarantee minority voices and minority representation. But what it has actually done is to decrease political competition because of the massive advantages it has conferred upon the incumbent government, as we just explained earlier, right? So I think insofar as proposition is able to prove why we do get minority representation anyways, the issue will then turn on the quality of the choice and how people therefore then perceive the government. So for the earlier argument, I think Prop does need to put in a bit more work to explain why it is likely you're going to get minorities anyways. But I think we will largely deal with that in this main point, but it can come up earlier if that would be preferable. So dealing with the idea here, right? So why do we get minority representation anyways? So I think you want to frame it as this policy was a necessity and we think it was a good thing, but that is fundamentally in the past, right? When society was more racially fraught. But I think it's safe to say that over the decades since independence, younger Singaporeans, by virtue of having been in a system where racial harmony, racial integration, and racial representation have been heavily emphasized, are unlikely to be the types of individuals we used to be so concerned about, i.e. the types of individuals who vote along racial lines. So the way to frame it is that policies such as this, such as the GRC system, in the past is basically what the government said when they were working towards a more colorblind Singapore, and that this is a crutch we simply do not need to rely on forever. And in fact, there are a couple of very prominent minority ministers as examples for this, right? So examples below, both with regards to the PAP and with regards to opposition. So it proves that minorities can actually succeed in parliament by their own merit, that people are generally more accepting, especially the younger generation. And this is a reason why we do not need the system anymore, because the benefits it purported to confer are benefits that can already be achieved by virtue of the fact that we as a society have changed in our perceptions and in our beliefs. But I think on proposition, there's also the added benefit that they can claim, which is that it lends these candidates more legitimacy, i.e. that they did not just get in as part of the quota. And also at the end of the day, it encourages the colorblind Singapore the government wants. Like, you now have, say, minorities there, not because to meet the quota, but because they are candidates who can stand off their own right. And we think parties will have an interest to field minority candidates anyways, right, for the sake of representation, for the sake of appealing to minority communities. So we think that they will still field the candidates anyways. The difference is that they now have more legitimacy because they're seen to be there because they ought to be there, and not just because they are there to fit the requirement for everybody else to be able to run. I think that's quite a powerful and quite an empowering statement to make. But I think it's important to acknowledge on Prop that even if at the end of the day, proposition does get less minorities overall, they still do guarantee that the rights of minorities are protected in other ways. So for instance, the Presidential Council of Minority Rights that has the power to make criticisms on bills that they deem to be discriminatory towards minorities, and these bills will be edited. So there are structural mechanisms in place that prevent, say, for instance, the worst excesses of discrimination, but overall, unlikely to happen. So how exactly then do we get more competition between parties, right? And I think this is something that was hinted at earlier. So this is taking it to a wider scale level. The first argument relates more to candidates within parties. This is in the system in general. So first, obviously, as explained earlier, is that it lessens the massive gap between the parties that is based on the structure of the voting system. Both parties can now better contest on the merits of their policies and the quality of their candidates, rather than how best they are able to spread out their candidates. And that at the end of the day, this is a good thing, because proposition isn't saying, okay, so I think it's important to clarify that proposition's angle shouldn't be, we must abolish the GRC for Workers' Party to win, right? Maybe that might be a more likely outcome in Proposition's world. But I think the point Prop is trying to prove is that it necessarily improves people's perceptions of the political system when they now see that there is more competition, there's more quote unquote fairness, because in recent years, a lot more people, and I think especially the younger generation, have become more disillusioned with the system. So yeah, two benefits here. The incumbent party would get more legitimacy when they aren't seen to be gerrymandering by redrawing the boundaries for GRCs in every election. The impact is that people are likely going to be able to see this as more of a fair fight. So this confers a benefit to whoever wins. And it also, I guess, takes away lines of rhetoric that parties can use, for instance, i.e. maybe that they're not winning seats because it's unfair. So when the system is obviously fair, I think it improves the quality of politics as a whole. And this is important because it's an independent benefit, regardless of how the system turns out. What will happen is that change in how people perceive their government, and it's important because standard argument, right? For the system to have weight, it must be seen as legitimate, it must be seen as credible. So this brings me to my third argument. I don't think this is as important, but perhaps it could be used as a second speaker argument, which is that on the whole, now you have more efficient management of constituencies. I think some constituencies are generally bigger than others, especially the 6-member constituencies. And while they do obviously have the requisite number of candidates to split up the work, it's a bit hard to compete between the various needs of individuals in these places. So some of it might be industrial, some of it might be housing. I think this might relate to GRCs in the West. So when constituencies are smaller on the whole, people are better able to focus on what exactly they need to be done, and the candidates that represent them can also do this. So this argument might need a bit more explanation, but I think it's relatively straightforward, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Yep, so this brings me to the opposition case. So the cost that opposition will have to bear is that there might be a lack of competitiveness due to the higher burden on other parties. So opposition is defending status quo. So same as prop, but flipped. Why the GRC system is firstly not so harmful, such that we ought to abolish it. And secondly, why we can actually ensure competitiveness in other ways, or why competitiveness is not the a priori consideration, or why can competitiveness at the end of the day be triggered off. So, and the policy is obviously status quo, we retain the GRC system. So I think this is the most strategic point for opposition to be able to capitalize on, right? Which is that we need to be able to guarantee minority representation in parliament. And I think insofar as OP is able to prove why this is the most important thing, as long as OP is able to mitigate props benefits. So talk about how it's uncertain, talk about how it's so speculative, and why exactly then can minority representation, or why exactly should minority representation not just be something that is speculative, right? And so this comes in and set up, why exactly is this the most important issue in the debate? So I think OP can point out that the presence of other safeguards are insufficient. So for instance, using the same example of the Presidential Council on Minority Rights, it's not enough because what it does is that it just ratifies existing policies to make sure they're not discriminatory. But it does not guarantee legislature that does benefit minorities, right? And the vote is the only way to get minorities into the legislature to actively pass policies catered to them. So also worthwhile to explain why this won't happen anyways. And I think it's that the need for focus on the issues that uniquely impact minorities. And this is something that candidates from those communities will be better able to push for, perhaps because they grew up with these individuals, they're more likely to care about them because they better understand the struggles. Other candidates might care, and we think they do, but we think the degree to which they care, the degree to which they understand will necessarily be different by virtue of the fact that they are not members of that community. So here you have a better understanding of the needs of these people. You're more likely to see it as a more important issue in comparison to other issues. So this is not to say that non-minority candidates do not care, because I think they absolutely do. The point here is to say that they care to different extents. So this has a lot to do with the upbringing and the communities that they did live in. And why exactly is this point independent of outcomes, right? Like, why exactly do we need to guarantee the presence of representation? And this is because of optics, right? And optics is actually something that is incredibly important in politics. I think that's quite a valuable argument to run in politics debates, right? Because politics is, at the end of the day, to a large degree, about how things look. So it doesn't matter even in prop school, if they are able to pass policies that are good for minorities, it doesn't matter if they're able to pass policies that are sufficiently nuanced to help minorities, right? It does not matter because at the end of the day, if the number of minorities in parliament is substantially lower or substantially non-existent, it does not matter the types of policies you pass for these people, insofar as these people do not feel represented. So I think what can guarantee is that they will absolutely have a greater quantity of minorities. And this means that these people are likely going to be more satisfied and more trusting of the government because they see them as representing their own interests. It's not just about whether or not they do represent, it's whether or not they see them representing it. And this is also in line with Singapore's image of a multiracial state. I think it's important to sufficiently impact this as well. That is that too important an issue for us to simply do away with. We can't risk backsliding. Racial issues are always delicate. Simply put, we cannot take our current state of racial harmony as something that is granted. That we do definitively need these safeguards in place, because if we backslide, the harms could necessarily be detrimental. So why exactly is the GRC system the only way to guarantee this? And this would deal with if Prop came up with more soft line stance and said, well, we will still have quotas for the number of candidates that parties can run anyways, right? So I think the first is that people at the end of the day are people, and people have subconscious biases towards those who look like them, towards people with the same background as them. And it's important to frame this as being regardless of whether or not people are racist. Because I generally think, say for instance, most people in Singaporean society aren't just rampaging racist, right? So it's important to be charitable with the types of characterization that you give with regards to status quo. So here are some examples as to why exactly people do have subconscious biases. And I think the use of examples here is particularly valuable when you want to make a claim like this, right? So tie it back into things the judge is likely to know, observations the judge is likely to have to confirm things that the judge is likely to then therefore going to be able to believe you on. So the first is that safe to say most people aren't racist, but a majority of their friends are people who are substantially similar to them. This is because same culture, same upbringing, they're better able to bond with them. This is because of things like the familiarity bias. I think a really good example of why we cannot afford to have backsliding by taking away our safeguards is with regards to the recent reserved presidential election. Like the fact that Singapore did have to have a reserved presidency because of the fact that there was a lack of minority candidates for that duration of time goes to show that even though we are progressing as a society, there is still the need sometimes to guarantee that degree of representation. And if it can happen with regards to presidential election, who's to say it doesn't happen with regards to general election? And that's a fundamental reason why we ought to keep these safeguards in place, because even if we don't generally need it, there's always the off chance that we might. And with regards to those situations, having the safeguard is something that is incredibly, incredibly important. Okay, so second point on this, right, which is that SMCs are a lot harder for minorities and that there is no guarantee of representation for them. So it might be possible for more established minority candidates, that goes without saying, but it's much harder for newer ones to be able to do so when they don't have the same backing and they don't have the same perceived legitimacy, right? It's incredibly hard for new minorities to be able to make it into parliament, and this will then compromise, say for instance, future minority representation. So this takes at quite a charitable level, right? Even if you do guarantee minority representation in status quo, it's something you cannot guarantee in the future. So the harms are still there. You're just kicking the can down the road. So yeah, as an example is that the minorities who are currently political superstars is because they're very well established. But if we did not have the system, who's to say they would even have gotten into parliament in the first place? Who's to say they would necessarily be in the positions that they are today? So for the sake of continuing this in the following generations, we do need these safeguards in place in order to have it. So what exactly is the trade-off? I think it's important to acknowledge that there will therefore be some degree of piggybacking. So whether or not the piggybacking is with regards to minority candidates or the other candidates. And I personally think it's with both. So the trade-off opposition should therefore be making, and this doesn't necessarily have to come up in first. I just put it here for the sake of convenience. This is something that should absolutely come up though at some point, be it in second or absolutely in your whip speakers, right? Which is that piggybacking is okay if it's the only way to get minorities into parliament to the degree that we need them to be in parliament, right? So even if there are some non-minority candidates who will piggyback in, given that it's harder for minority candidates to get in anyways, we think on the whole, the harm of a few mediocre majority candidates getting in is still significantly less than the harm of having less minority candidates as a whole. And so why does this weigh up against other points like, say, competitiveness, right? And the reason is because with regards to competitiveness, it's a bit hard to do away with the incumbency advantage that PAP will always have. They're always going to have that because they're more established, whether or not you have an SMC or not. But this is a problem that is self-correcting, i.e. the incumbency advantage will go away with time as Singapore's political scene develops more. But this problem, the problem of racial representation, it's much harder to say that this is a point that will definitively go away, because the idea of race and how people interact with things like that, it's not something that you can say will 100% go away with time, the way an incumbency advantage will go away with time, right? By virtue of the fact that we are human, this means that we are fallible. This means that we must guarantee representation by having these safeguards in place, because for reasons explained earlier, we simply cannot afford to backslide. So this leads me to the second argument, which is how exactly it is we guarantee the training of young talent and quality candidates in the future, right? So Prop frames it as, right now we need to motivate them to be competitive. I think Op can take the angle of, we want the same thing, but there's a need to guarantee this for the future. So the problem right now, I think both sides would agree, is that parties are generally more headed and more led by the old and established members. This might just be a problem with politics in general, but the way you want to frame this is that there is a tendency to become complacent in status quo if parties can simply just win on this alone. So while proposition does not deny the fact that these parties understand that at some point they need members, but status quo, ultimately, opposition can frame it as, is that it gives these parties less of an incentive to train new members because it's not as, quote unquote, immediate a concern. So why exactly is retaining the GRC system the best way to go about doing this, right? And this is because abolishing is something that is short-sighted in nature. There is a need to train new candidates, and there is a need to give them legitimacy, right? Making sure that they've been people who are actually in parliament. You can't just run someone one day as a candidate for the first time and then make him a minister the next day, right? So what this means is that you do actually need the system to piggyback candidates in, and that piggybacking candidates in is a good thing, as contrary to what proposition says. We already have an incentive to train them well, and this system is the only means by which they are able to get that legitimacy for them to be able to meaningfully contest for stronger positions in the future. I think it's important that for opposition to argue that this applies to both parties, right? Not just the PAP. I think it's also important as opposition parties develop that they do focus on training these new candidates in. So the same idea of piggybacking can be applied to opposition parties. If they do have a few strong candidates, the only way in which they're able to get their much newer candidates and therefore take over that idea of the incumbency advantage is also if those new members piggyback in. So there is definitely scope for Op to argue that this is applicable to both parties, and it's applicable for everybody's future, because the old guard in the respective parties can only carry the party for so long. So a tangential point on rebuttal, if it is brought up, is that this doesn't actually infringe on choice, because the people in a certain GRC vote a certain party because they want that superstar minister and not the other four. That is okay, because people still get what they want. They know the other four people are running, so they think one of these ministers is necessarily so good that they want to vote the other four in. That's okay, that's a valid choice. This is just in the event that proposition does bring up that argument. Yep, so this leads me to the point on weighing, right? Again, this is something that should come up by the end of the debate. It doesn't have to come up in first, but this is the trade-off that opposition ultimately does need to be able to make, right? Which is that if we abolish the GRC system, the harm is still going to be symmetric, because even in an SMC system, the party with more candidates, more established candidates, are still more likely to win, because presumably proposition is not going to stop or ban the more established candidates from running, right? So even in an SMC, the PAP can still field their established candidates, and at the end of the day, they will have more established candidates. So the harm is not something that really changes significantly or meaningfully. So the way opposition can frame this as winning, right, is that the difference in this debate is then whether or not new members are going to be able to make it into parliament. And it is very unlikely on the sides of both parties when we abolish the GRC system. So this affects both sides. And I think more so you can flip this argument and say it affects the party with less established candidates more, because comparatively, Op has more less established candidates than the incumbent party. So That's because all of their members are comparatively newer. So being able to piggyback members in is necessarily something that would benefit opposition more, because these members are less likely to get in on the whole, right? So important to acknowledge that status quo is not perfect, but this is likely to be significantly worse. I think this is quite an important point with dealing with weighing in general, right? Which is that sometimes status quo isn't a great thing, and sometimes your benefit might not be massive, but in any given debate, you don't have to be proving absolutely massive benefits to be able to win the round. You just have to be doing a comparatively better job than the team that you're against. So it is okay if the harm or the benefit isn't absolutely massive, but as long as you can frame it in a strategic angle, it can actually be debate winning. And I think this point is an example of that, right? To prove that it affects both sides. So therefore, the harm is symmetric, and therefore not abolishing it is the only way in which we actually give opposition some degree of advantage to level the playing field. So third argument, again, just a flip of the second speaker argument that I already gave for proposition, so won't spend too much time on this. Just an example of how, just an explanation, sorry, of how these constituencies work is that now you have teams to split up the area, people can sit around, people can discuss. This is a good thing because we have better problem-solving abilities. You get, 5 minds to put it together and think about how exactly you can help the people in these communities. It's not going to be inefficient because you can split up the constituencies, like Pasir Ris East, Pasir Ris West, for instance, is an example of that. So we can still have that same degree of efficiency, but it's better because now you have a team on it rather than just a singular person by themselves. So this will also lend more weight to the issues faced by these constituencies in Parliament when you have more members backing it up. And yeah, that concludes the review for NUSPA 2023 quarterfinals. This is quite a brief review since I think teams generally do know the types of arguments to make. I hope this was helpful regarding the types of angles you can take and how exactly the trade-offs and the weighing could have been done. So if you have any further questions, like if there were points you did not know how to rebut, there were points you think could have been made but didn't, feel free to drop them in the comment section and I will reply them at some